All right, we're ready for chapters 17 and 18 in our study of Revelation. We grouped these two together for a couple of reasons. Time constraints as we get toward the end of our trimester. And secondly, subject matter, we grouped them together. We're in the second section of the book, which deals with Christ and the dragon in conflict. We've looked at the war section, 12 to 14. That goes together as a unit of chapters. 15 and 16 is another unit of chapters that deal with the bowls of wrath. And 17 and 18 deal with the fall of Babylon the harlot. Chapter 19 also talks about that in part, and hence the reference to 3 chapters later in a quotation I will give you. But we're talking about the fall of Babylon the harlot. Chapter 17 and 18 deal with Babylon as a harlot that's going to fall, which is obviously a reference to Rome. The reason for that, as we've already been introduced in chapter 14, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Chapter 14, chapter 16 has referred to Rome as Babylon because Babylon was the great enemy for a period of time. Assyria was the great enemy at one point. Egypt was the great enemy at a different point. But Babylon was the great enemy. Called here Babylon the Great. Literal Babylon will not fit the context at all. And so if we make it literally refer to Babylon and not Rome, it doesn't seem to make any sense. It was called a great city, verse 18. And furthermore, there's a reference to 7 hills, 7 mountains at verse 9 of our context. And Rome was called the 7-hilled city. And so consequently, this must have reference to Rome. Jeremiah 51, without our tracing that for this moment, we'll come back to Jeremiah 51 later, but Jeremiah 51 is a prophecy of the fall of the nation of Babylon. Not Rome, but of Babylon. And similar language is used. And as we mentioned in our introduction to the book of Revelation, that Revelation is heavily influenced by language of the Old Testament so that the recipient who would be familiar with the Old Testament would get the message. A reference to Babylon is the enemy. A reference to Babylon falling is a reference back to Jeremiah 51 and other passages in Isaiah. So here's what we have now in chapter 17. Chapter 17 identifies Babylon the harlot, and that Babylon is a harlot. Here is her nature. Chapter 18 talks about how Babylon will fall. We've already been introduced to that in chapter 14, but here we see Babylon is fallen, and mentioning in past tense. So 2 things happen here in this chapter, and we'll come to our questions after this. We see John's vision of the great harlot, verses 1 to 6, and then there's the explanation of this great mystery. And this will get us through verse 18. Now, we're going to have to work through that because we've got to get to chapter 18 and make our way through the fall. Let's go to our questions now. Question number 1. Give a description of the great harlot.
Arrayed like a queen or princess, royal colors, precious stones.
All right. Good. Anything else? Where does she sit? On the many waters. The scene shifts and she's sitting on the beast. Yeah. Possible in a vision. And we'll say more about that in a moment. Question number 2. Who or what does the great harlot represent? Rome. The Roman Empire. Question number 3. Let's give a description of the beast from this chapter 17. All right. 7 heads, 10 horns, full of blasphemous names. More about that in a moment. Question number 4. Who or what does the beast represent? Yeah, the Roman emperor, I think. Because he'd been identified earlier in what chapter had talked about the beast of the sea and the beast of the land. What chapter? It wasn't found in the first 12. 13. All right. Yeah, we're quick. I like that. All right. Let's go to chapter, a key verse. I try to give that each time. Verse 1, I think, summarizes the chapter. All right, let's talk about the vision of the great harlot. The first verse, this simply says, one of the seven angels that had the seven bowls of wrath said, "Come and I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." She's called a harlot because she seduced, and so it's pictured as a harlot because she seduced men to commit spiritual fornication by the worship of the emperor. That's spiritual fornication. We're going to see more about that in a moment. Now then, beginning at verse 1b through verse 6 is a description of this great harlot. What did he see in this vision? So let's work our way through these representations or these descriptions. The first thing is she sits on many waters. What do the waters represent? The people. Look at verse 15. And he said, "The waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitude, nations, and tongues." And so we're told what that means. So she's sitting on many waters, which may suggest the influence, the size and the influence of the empire. So I think this has reference to the Roman Empire, as we've already talked about. You're going to see more evidence as we go along. But here's the size and the influence. She's sitting on many waters, many peoples, nations, and tongues, etc. Found at verse 15. Now then, the second description given at verse 2 is she committed fornication with kings and the inhabitants of the earth. What is that about? Yeah, by forcing through the Roman Concilia we talked about in chapter 13, by forcing emperor worship, they're forcing people to commit spiritual adultery and commit spiritual idolatry or adultery. So by forcing them to do that, causing men to worship the beast, they're causing men committing fornication with kings and the inhabitants of the earth. Now the scene shifts at verse 3. Because as she was sitting on many waters, remember, anything's possible in a vision. Suddenly, this harlot is sitting on the beast. And that makes us think of chapter 13. This must be the beast of Romans 13, which would have reference to the Roman emperor. Let's drop down to verse 7. Verse 7 shows that she's sitting on the beast in the sense that the emperor supports and carries the empire. I'll show you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her. So he supports the empire through his leadership, through his commands, etc. And then some descriptions are given of him. There are three descriptions, and these are not of the harlot, but of the beast. So let's talk about each one of those things. One of the descriptions is full of blasphemy, names of blasphemy. What would that have reference to? Yeah, by the you were to burn incense and say Caesar is Lord, and so he claimed to be deity. He was deified. He was claimed to be God. The seven heads are going to be explained at verse 9, so we'll save that for a moment. But the 10 horns may suggest generally horns referred to power. Don't think literally it's the idea of some 10 horns, but it's of great power that he has. So he's very influential. And so she's sitting on this. So there's a close connection between the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor, and we're going to see this great harlot fall. Now, verse 4 talks about her appearance. Her appearance was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, which suggests she makes herself attractive. That's what harlots do, so that they can attract people for their fornication. So she makes herself attractive, and she seduces people, and she has in her hand what? A golden cup. Now, what you would expect from a golden cup would be something pure and precious. What does she have in this cup? Verse 4. All kinds of impurities. Look at verse 4. Full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Now, literally, you can't put fornication in a cup. But this is in a vision. So it's full of all kinds of corruption, all kinds of idolatry, all kinds of false worship, and all kinds of fornication, all kinds of sin. She is full of in this cup. So she makes herself attractive and has a golden cup, and you're to drink of that cup, and you're drinking fornication, and she corrupts you. And so we see something about her influence. Now, verse 5, there was a message on her forehead. And what was the message? All right, let's go back now, and you might make a marginal note at verse 5, if you care to, of references to Babylon earlier, Rome being referred to as Babylon. Chapter 14, verse 8, there was the statement, Babylon is fallen, the great city. We saw it again in chapter 16 and in verse 19, just prior to this, that, and great Babylon is remembered before God, and give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And so hear it again. So this obviously has reference to Rome, and because of her lustful seduction and her wickedness, she's like unto ancient Babylon. And so she's called Babylon the harlot, the mother of abominations. Now let's get verse 6. What does verse 6 say about this harlot? Yeah, you don't literally get drunk on blood, but it's like she's been drinking the blood of the saints, and she's drank so much of it, she's drunk with the blood. What does that tell you?
I think that, as they martyred Christians, there was more, how do you say that? There's so much enthusiasm behind that they just killed more.
Yeah.
And they were drunk on the blood.
In that sense, yeah, that's a good point. That, yeah, they get excited and just do more, just like a drunkard who gets drunk, and then they want more, and they want more, and they want to drink more, and want to drink more. Let's kill more Christians. And so she's responsible for the death of the saints who would not bow to the pressure. Like those saints under the altar back earlier in the book that we talked about. Yeah, she's celebrating, but she's drunk. In other words, she has killed and killed and killed and killed and killed, and the martyrs that are there, she's responsible for that. So that's the description of the great harlot now. So now let's go to verse 7, beginning. What do we have beginning at verse 7? Yeah, the angel said, why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. And so here is the explanation. There is an explanation concerning the beast, and there's an explanation concerning the harlot. Very little is said about the harlot. That's been a great description given, but he talks more about the beast. And so 8 to 14 and then 16 to 17, only 2 verses are devoted to the harlot. And so we're going to talk about the description of the beast here for a little bit. Let's talk about the beast. Now this is the more difficult section of chapter 17 for what that may be worth to us. The beast, I'm convinced, refers to the Roman emperor. He was identified in chapter 13, and if our understanding of 13 be correct, and I think it is, then this would have reference to the Roman emperor, Domitian. But it includes more than that. The previous and the following, any that would come after, we're going to see more about that here in just a moment. Let's look at these descriptions. First of all, he was and is not and yet is, according to verse 8. The beast that you saw, which was not and yet is. What does that refer to? All right. I don't think that we have any record of a Roman emperor that lived and then died and then rose again. Anybody know of one? I know of one man that died and rose again, and that was the Lord. So I don't think he's talking about a literal resurrection. Probably he's talking about a lull after Nero in the persecution. Nero was quite severe in his persecution, and then there was a lull, and then it comes back again, strong under Domitian. You say not? Maybe that's not the case. I'm not sure then what it refers to. And so he was and is not and yet is. And yet verse 8 and verse 11 says he's destined for destruction. Look at verse 8. That he, well, I've lost my place. Yeah, the beast that was not and descended out of the billows pit, and those who dwell on the earth and whose names are not written in the book of life. Now drop down to verse 11. The beast that was and is not is himself the eighth, and is going to perdition, going to destruction. I take that to eternal destruction. Not just that he's going to fall, but he's destined for eternal destruction. That he's going to fall, but he's also going to be eternally destroyed. Now he has 7 heads at verses 9 and 10. Suggesting maybe, notice though verse 9, he said, here is the mind which is wisdom. Now, that's an interesting phrase. We saw that earlier in chapter 13 and in verse 18. In other words, here's the explanation of that. Here is the wisdom. The 7 heads most likely has a reference to the 7 hills, being Rome was the 7-hilled city. But what would that suggest to you? Those 7 heads represent 7 kings. The text says so. The 7 heads on which he said, these are also 7 kings. Your translation may word that just a little different, that these are also 7 kings. In other words, the 7 heads represent 7 kings. I don't think that represents literal 7 kings, because making that number work with the Roman Empire doesn't fit. But it must have reference as, and let me quote from Haley. Haley suggests that this has reference to the whole or the group of the kings of the Roman emperors. Whatever their number was, that he refers to them as 7 because of the number 7 having to do with completeness. But he said the 7 kings therefore are a symbolic number representing all the kings or kingdoms, past, present, or future, that would oppose the kingdom of God. Each who would come would still be a part of the 7. So however many there may be, he's a part of this group of 7. And so this represents the 7 kings. The 7 mountains represent, there are 7 heads, 7 mountains, which are the 7 kings. Now then, notice though at verse 10, this gets interesting. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and another is yet to come. What on earth?
I think that can also be alluded to. Was, is not, and yet is not the one particular ruler, but the position of Caesar itself. All of them are wicked. All of them are persecuting Christians. So I think that could allude also to the actual position of being the emperor or the Caesar.
All right, very powerful, very powerful. All right, let's talk about this 5th. Let me quote from Harkrider, who I think captured the thought better than I can word it. He said, since 7 represents the whole, the 5 is a broken number, incomplete number. This suggests that of the total number of kings who have been and shall be, the greater part of them have come and gone. So 5 are fallen. 1 that is refers to the current reigning power. The 7th king is yet to reign, and that only for a brief time. And so he's talking about the kings. I think he's talking about the Roman emperor here, till we get down to verse 12, and we're going to talk about provincial kings. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. But what about the Roman emperor? Well, some have fallen. There is 1 in power now. There is more yet to come. And then the beast is said to be the 8th yet of the 7. Now that gets a little difficult. How can that be? Let me quote from Barnes. Barnes makes the point, he's so essentially combined and concentrated that all there is was in the 7. The point is that Domitian and the Roman Empire were so corrupt that they embodied all the evil kings represented. In other words, these 7 kings, the fullness of these kings, that here is one, he's the 8th, and he's embodied in those 7. He has the same characteristic of those 7. Now then, I think he turns and talks about the provincial kings, that are his kings in the provinces, that's not a part of the Roman Empire. I mean, it is part of the Roman Empire, but he's not the Roman emperor himself. Beginning at verse 12, the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who receive no kingdom as of yet, and they receive authority for 1 hour as kings, and the beast, they're of one mind. So what does that suggest to you? These kings have authority
Delegated down from Caesar.
from the emperor. But what are they going to do? They're going to do what? Whatever he wants. Look at verse 14. You might underline verse 14. I'll tell you why in just a moment. Might make a star beside it. Make a big to-do about verse 14. They will make war with the Lamb. When the Roman Empire and all of its subsequent underlings make war against the people of God, they're actually making war with the Lamb of God. And what will the Lamb do? He's going to overcome them because he's Lord of Lords, King of Kings. And those who are with him called, chosen, and faithful. Come back to that verse in a moment. All right. Now notice at verse 16. Let's drop down to verse 16. That the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, they will hate the harlot. Now, what does that tell you? Yeah. I think these provincial kings are going to turn on Rome and contribute to the destruction. Inner turmoil. It wasn't always possible to keep all these underling, for lack of better terms, these underling kings under control. And they helped bring down the destruction of Rome, and that they did. Now, I want to get ahead of myself. Now, the reason I had you mark verse 14, I've marked that as a summary of the whole book. Maybe you think another verse summarizes the entire book. We called attention to this in our introduction to the book of Revelation. But you want a good summary of the book? They'll make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome. So the Roman Empire, the Roman emperor, all of his underlings are going to make war with the Lamb. How'd they do that? By making war with the people of God. They're making war with the Lamb. And the Lamb is going to be victorious because our Lamb, our Christ, is Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and those who are called, chosen, and faithful, etc. Make sense? Summarizes the book in my mind. That's why I ask you to mark that. I think you'll find that helpful in summarizing the book. Now, let's back up and get the harlot found in verse 15. What do we know about the harlot? From verse 15. She sits on many waters, which are a reference to people, nations, and tribes, etc. So she's very influential. Verse 18 now, what do we know about her? She's a great city which reigns over kings of the earth. She's very powerful, this great harlot, and she's sitting on the beast. And so now let's talk about the point. That's the two things we learn about the harlot. The waters are the people and the nations, and this woman is the great city. So it must have reference to Rome. Now then, what's the point of chapter 17? If you said, here's what we're driving at, here's what the Lord is driving at through John. What's the point of chapter 17? All right. In the end, the Lord's going to be victorious. Absolutely. Rome is a great harlot, a corrupt woman. And we're going to see what happens to her in chapter 18. Questions or comments on 17? All right, let's go back to our questions now, and let's get a few of those. Question number 6. List reasons from chapter 18 for the fall of Babylon the Great. All right, very good. We'll come back to every one of those in just a moment. Let's get number 7. Give a description from chapter 18 of what Rome used to be.
Great city that influenced the nations around her, rotten with sin, so bad it reached the heights of heaven. Great pride, luxury.
Very good, very good. Question number 8, a description of what Rome became. Yeah, it became a prison, became a stench. She became a wasteland. All right, chapter 18. Key verse would be verse 2. This deals with the fall of Babylon the harlot. Verse 2 says, and you might underline, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. That's what this chapter is about. And so if we jump to 18 and don't have an influence of chapter 14 and chapter 13 and chapter 17, we're kind of confused. Babylon is fallen. Babylon is the Rome here. Babylon is fallen. So chapter 17 identified the Roman Empire as Babylon the great harlot. This chapter announces the fall. Let's go to a couple of Old Testament references quickly. Similar language. Let's go to the book of Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah 21 and look at verse 9. This is the quotation, seemingly the reference that's being alluded to. And look, here comes the chariot with a pair of horsemen, and he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. Exact phrase we just looked at. Let's go to Jeremiah 51. I'm just trying to give you some reference. Jeremiah 51 and in verse 8. These are not the only references. But Babylon has suddenly fallen and been destroyed. Well for her. In the nations section, remember it's talking about nations sections of the prophets. Those two talks about the fall of Babylon. So let's work through four things here. First of all, there's the announcement of her fall. An angel with great authority announced this, the fall. So let's notice, beginning at verse 1. Three things are announced in this fall. First, Babylon is fallen, is fallen. What does that phrase tell you?
Regardless of whether what's going to happen, it seems like Babylon's winning or Rome is winning, that it's going to fall. I mean, the Lord has declared it.
Very good. Remember chapter 4? What was the main point we learned from chapter 4, the throne scene? God is on his throne and in control. And if that's true, God's going to bring Babylon down. And so here's the announcement. Babylon is fallen. Has Babylon, at the time this is being written and disseminated to the first century, has it fallen? No, but it's past tense. Why? Prophetic perfect. Prophetic perfect means that God speaks of things that are not, that is future, as though they are in past tense, because of the certainty with which God's promises come. So if God says Babylon is going to fall, you can put it down in past tense. It's done. And so Babylon is fallen. It's compounded in emphasis by Babylon, not just Babylon is fallen, but Babylon is fallen, was the great announcement. Now then, it talks about what Babylon has become at verse 2. Here's what Babylon has become. It has become a prison for a habitation of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, a cage for every unclean and hated spirit. Perhaps taken similar language, it could be found in Isaiah 34, Jeremiah 51, and Zephaniah 2. William Hendrickson said that it was so bad, the utter desolation of Babylon was so bad that even unclean spirits and unclean hated birds considered a prison. It's how bad it has become. Now, verse 3, what's the reason for her fall? Because yeah, and very good point. There very well may have been literal sexual immorality, but it's probably referring to spiritual adultery, by causing men to worship the emperor and causing others to join in with that. Now then, there's another voice from heaven in verses 4 to 8. What does this voice say? I heard another voice saying, a voice says to the people of God, come out from her, my people, lest you share in her sins and lest you receive of her plagues. In other words, I think that's the point being made from that. It may have reference to, Babylon is going to fall and the people of God need to leave. But I don't think it's so much a literal they need to leave, but it's suggesting God's going to take care of his people. There is a remnant, and there always has been, there always will be. Does that make sense? So what about God's people? God's going to take care of his people. Does that mean they won't die? No, because there's already been murders. But God's going to take care of them. And we'll see them as part of 144,000 gathered around the throne. God's going to take care of his people. He's going to take them out of that number. They're not a part of the number that God's bringing destruction upon. Now, beginning at verse 5, what does he say, this second voice say? All right. Here is the just reward that she's going to receive. Her sins reached to heaven. What does that suggest to you? Yeah. Not literally they reach to heaven, but if you were to start piling the sins up, and here's one sin and then throw another sin on top of that, and finally they pile up to the heavens. I mean, there's not just a slight offense with this nation. They reach the heavens. Down to verse 8. Notice, verse 7. She's going to receive such that she thinks she sits as a queen, and I am no widow and will not see sorrow. She's arrogant. She's proud. She thinks there's no danger of falling. And consequently, though, she falls, and she does so suddenly, and she goes from queenhood to widowhood. Now let's start at verse 9. What about those who mourn for her? 9 to 19. Who mourns for her? All right? Those who commit sexual immorality with her, spiritual adultery again, and those who benefit from her somehow. So it mentions, and we see this and we don't have time to go back to Jeremiah and Isaiah, but there were people who were wailing over, like Jeremiah 51 talks about, the wailing over the fall of Babylon. Babylon was so great and powerful, many depended upon Babylon, did business with Babylon. When Babylon falls, that affects others. For example, maybe a poor illustration, but let's just suppose that this nation collapses and falls and economically it's gone. Do you think that'll affect any other nation? There's a lot of business we do with China, for example. There's a lot of business we do with other nations, and so it's going to affect others, and they're going to stand back kind of wailing over the fall of our nation because it affects them. Same thing here. So first of all, there are kings. And so verses 9 and 10, what do the kings say? I mean, not the exact wording, but what's their point? They are absolutely amazed. Not only that they've fallen, you're right, but they've fallen so quickly and so soon. In an hour, not a literal hour here, but that it's like Babylon was great and powerful, and in an hour she's gone. Wow. Why would they say that? Or are they thinking it wouldn't fall? I'm driving, though, at a point. Let's suppose this nation falls and president of another nation is going to be kind of, oh my, the U.S. collapsed and fell. And why is he so worried? Say again? It could happen to him. Yeah, that's one of the reasons these kings, they were and then they were not, and that could happen to our nation. They're thinking. Well, the merchants, verse 11 to 17, the merchants are all upset. And those who do business with Rome. What does this suggest? There's total economic ruin of the nation. Now, the souls of men being sold perhaps has reference to slave trade. I don't know, but it very well may be, and I'll leave it at that. Then the shipmasters, for the same reason, the shipmasters who do business with them, they're mourning over her fall. I want to move on to get to the cause of that her fall causes rejoicing in heaven. Now, notice verse 20. What does verse 20 say to you? I know it says, "O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her." I know it's the wording, but what's the point? Yeah, it's people who are being vindicated because of the fall of Rome. The New Century translates it thus: "Be happy because of this heaven. Be happy, God's holy people and apostles and prophets God has punished her because of what she did to you. In other words, it's perhaps speaking to the 145, y'all rejoice. Because look, because you're dead because of what she did, and look what's happened to this harlot. She's fallen. Now, I quickly looked at that because I want to quickly get to this to wind this up. The finality of her fall is illustrated by what? By what? Okay. Yeah. Now, millstone is a large, 2 inches, half a foot thick, 6 inches thick, Albert Barnes says, and 2 feet in diameter. So you're talking about a stone 2 feet in diameter and 6 inches thick, quite weighty. And if it's thrown out into the middle of the sea, what happens to it? Sinks, and it's gone, and it's not going to be recovered. And so Babylon is gone. Babylon is fallen. He illustrates that by taking and throwing this. Well, that's not going to float back to the top, is it? And so he demonstrates that. And thus, with violence, the great city of Babylon is thrown down and shall not be found anymore. Some argue this is not talking about Rome because Rome still exists. The persecuting Rome of John's day does not exist. And Summers develops that argument a little more. Now, let's talk about the activity will cease. I want to make 3 points here, and I borrow these 3 phrases from Summers. That the activity of this nation is going to cease. Summers mentions 3 things. The amusement life, verse 22a, is over. In other words, sound of music is gone. So once Babylon is fallen, the sound of the music and the instruments are gone. It's not there. The amusement life is gone. The business life is over. Verse 22b. No craftsman will be found in the city. The millstone will not be grinding. It's over. And the home life is gone. The voice of the bridegroom won't be heard anymore. So when Babylon the harlot, Rome falls, it's like if you walk through the city and you say, we used to hear wedding ceremonies in this chapel. They're not anymore. Used to be families over here playing and laughing, and that's not anymore. Used to be music played over here, and it's not anymore. Used to be businesses, it's fallen, it's gone. It's over. Now, the reason was what? Verse 24, to finish this up. She had slain the prophets and saints. Babylon is fallen, So what's the point? The fall of Rome. Summers says all through this section, the main thing in the writer's mind is the fall of Rome. The enemy's going to fall. I like these quotations. Proverbs 14:34 said, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Did that apply to Rome? Absolutely. Barclay said, this is the fate of a city that built a civilization without God. When we have a civilization without God, it's going to collapse. And I like Summers' practical lesson. He said, nothing can be economically good that's morally bad. I like that. Nothing can be economically good that's morally bad. Emperor worship may have thought to be economically good because it united the nation, but it was morally bad. It fell. Questions or comments? Our time is gone.
It's also the fulfillment of all of Babylon, is the fulfillment of Daniel's interpreted vision of the statue of the last nation being destroyed by the ground of power.
Yeah. The last worldwide empire mentioned there, you're right. It fulfilled that prophecy. And it was going to fall, and it did. It did.